My name is Barbara Tepelupak. I'm author or editor of a number of books on film adaptation and silent films, including literary adaptations in Black American cinema from Michelle Morrison, early race filmmaking in America, silent serial sensations, the Wharton brothers and the magic of early cinema, and Richard E. Norman and race filmmaking. Richard E. Norman is one of my favorite early filmmakers, and I'm pleased to have the chance to speak to you about him and specifically about the ways that he attempted in his feature films to counter dominant cinema's demeaning racial stereotypes. My presentation is part of a new program series entitled Finding Their Voices, the representation of African American women in silent film, hosted by the Norman Studio Silent Film Museum in Jacksonville, Florida, and sponsored by a grant from Florida Humanities with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, whose support I gratefully acknowledge. Race films, which are the topic of this program series, had a deep and profound social and cultural impact. In themselves, the films were an amazing accomplishment, a separate cinema created by independent filmmakers, largely by Blacks, for Blacks, featuring Black actresses and actors, focusing on Black themes and issues, and shown primarily in Black or race theaters. And even though they were not widely distributed or exhibited, as for example were the films of D.W. Griffith and other more prominent early white filmmakers, they were crucial in responding to the racist imagery and defamatory stereotypes which reflected the social attitudes of the day and helped to fix in the public's mind the impression of African Americans and especially of African American women as servile, silly, submissive, or sexually indiscriminate. Race films challenged that imagery and typically provided honest depictions of Black life and experience without glossing over legitimate problems and serious concerns, such as caste distinctions within the race. It was that honesty and realism, absent in the dominant white cinema, that made race films so compelling for Black moviegoers and audiences. The period of silent race filmmaking was relatively short lived from about 1915 until 1929, when the introduction of talkies or sound films forced virtually all of the remaining race producers out of business. And by that point, very few were still operating. Only a handful of the early race films survive today, and the ones that do are not particularly well known. Nonetheless, those films are tremendously significant, both in terms of cinema and early 20th century sociopolitics and history. Like his better known contemporaries, Oscar Micheaux and the Johnson brothers, Richard E. Norman became one of the most successful and prolific race filmmakers of his day. What is surprising, perhaps, is that Norman was a Southern born white man, one of a small number of white filmmakers who produced films exclusively for race audiences. A savvy marketer, Norman capitalized on the popular fascination with exotic locales and new technologies like automobiles, trains, and airplanes, which he incorporated into the Flying Ace and his other features. A zealous self-promoter, he developed exploitation accessories like colorful graphic posters, and he devised elaborate promotions called ballyhoos to draw moviegoers inside the theaters to see his films. A fierce independent, Norman refused to amalgamate with other filmmakers or to seek backing from outside investors in his company, as many perpetually underfunded race filmmakers often tried to do. Instead, he self-financed his films, occasionally attempting creative alternative financing, such as a profit-sharing franchise by which he tried to sell advanced shares in his next picture. A businessman and true entrepreneur, Norman became the only early race filmmaker to purchase and own his own production studio, where he produced a number of his films. And after most early race filmmakers were forced out of the business by high production costs, poor distribution outlets, and the transition from silent to sound films, he found innovative ways to maintain his ties to the film industry. Yet, despite the fact that he was a worthy rival to both Micheaux and the Johnson brothers, his contribution to race filmmaking has long been underappreciated. Norman started his film career as a film developer, a cameraman, and then an independent producer of industrial and home talent moving pictures. That is, very short film playlets that featured ordinary citizens in pre-scripted storylines built around stock footage of spectacular events such as car chases and train wrecks, footage that Norman purchased or borrowed from other filmmakers. He traveled throughout the Midwest, stopping in small towns and shooting his home talent pictures, also called local talent pictures. And after developing the footage at the facility he operated in Des Moines, Iowa, he would return to the towns to exhibit the pictures at the local theaters or auditoriums. And after the initial showings, he would sell the prints back to the town so they could re-show them. It was a terrific marketing ploy. With cinema still in its infancy, the home talent films allowed ordinary citizens the chance to see themselves up on the big screen. And they, of course, welcomed the opportunity to become local celebrities. The benefits to Norman of such production were manifold. Not simply did he make a little money, but he also gained technical expertise in virtually all aspects of the fledgling film industry, from operating a camera to developing the prints, skills that would serve him well throughout his career. Most importantly, perhaps at least for himself personally, he met his wife Gloria, who appeared in the big wedding scene at the conclusion of one home talent version of The Wrecker, filmed in Marinette, Wisconsin. By 1919, though, Norman was ready to move on from home talent production to something bigger. So he decided to stake his claim in the burgeoning business of feature-length films. He relocated to his hometown of Jacksonville, which at the time was one of the early regional centers of modern filmmaking and considered the winter film capital of the world. Florida offered filmmakers numerous advantages: good weather, low labor costs, and established transportation routes to both the Northeast and the Midwest. Various major motion picture companies, from Kalem to SNA and Vitagraph, had already moved there for seasonal, or in some cases, year-round filming. It was there in Jacksonville that Norman began making his race pictures. During his time as an independent traveling producer, he had opportunity to observe the crowds of enthusiastic Black moviegoers at midnight rambles and special showings in white-owned theaters, where they were forced to sit in segregated balconies. He quickly recognized the financial potential in producing and distributing pictures for that broad but underrepresented market. There is no better angle of the motion picture business you can get into for quick returns and sure profit than Negro pictures, he wrote to a colleague. But according to his son, Captain Dick Norman, profit was not his father's sole motivation. Foremost was the desire to improve race relations, to help Black performers live up to their full potential, and to present Blacks in a better and more accurate light. Norman's feature films were notable for several reasons. First was the depiction of the post-war employment opportunities increasingly available to aspiring Blacks who had migrated north to work in new and emerging industries such as railways, steel, transportation, and construction, as you can see in this photograph. And second was the richness of the characters. Unlike the typical lowbrow comic stereotypes, that is, the ubiquitous mammies, Uncle Toms, pickaninnies, scheming Jezebels, and malicious or tragic mulattoes that dominated mainstream film of that era, Norman's characters were solidly middle-class professionals in positions of authority and dignity. Engineers, surveyors, ranchers, policemen, detectives, doctors. They dressed well, worked hard, and lived in spacious and elegant homes. Black moviegoers were used to seeing Black characters typed by their tattered and exaggerated garb, and restricted to roles as domestics and servants in mainstream white films, could and did take special pride in such anti-typing. As early as his first feature, Norman was quick to emphasize in his promotional materials that there is not a white man in the cast, a phrase that he repeated often in describing his later productions as well. Nor, he added, is there depicted in the entire picture anything of the usual mimicry of the Negro. That all Black casting was no doubt the reason even his rival George Johnson described Norman's productions as being among the biggest drawing cards ever played to Negro houses. Norman's race films spanned a wide variety of genres, from westerns and South Seas adventures to detective mystery stories and oil field intrigues. But there was one constant in all of his productions, and that is his protagonists, who distinguished themselves both by their professions and by their race ambition, which was consistent with the philosophy of racial uplift. In The Green-Eyed Monster, for example, the hero is a skilled railroad engineer who overcomes enormous odds to win the great mail race and clinch the government fast mail contract. In The Crimson Skull, the hero is a hardworking ranch foreman who battles outlaws who are just trying to destroy the tranquility of his peace-loving little town. In The Flying Ace, the hero is a distinguished wartime Black aviator and detective who must solve the mystery of the theft of the railroad payroll. And in Black Gold, Norman's final film, the hero is a rancher who fights to protect his oil-rich land from a greedy and scheming company that tries to claim his properties. As even this very brief overview reveals, Norman's heroes were uniformly ambitious and accomplished, professionals who provided positive role models whom Black audiences could and did aspire to be. But it was not just Norman's male protagonists who were so noteworthy. Norman's women were also ambitious and accomplished figures, and the ways that Norman shaped and cast their roles broke cinematic barriers and reversed prevailing stereotypes. Norman's first race picture, made in late 1919, was The Green-Eyed Monster, a combination comedy and drama, which received mixed reviews when it was originally released. Realizing that the two parts of the film clashed with each other and confused audiences, and that the farce detracted from the more serious storyline of the drama, Norman wisely split the film and released it as two separate features, which he titled The Green-Eyed Monster and The Love Bug. The latter, the comedy, was to be sure not his most racially enlightened or socially progressive film. It drew on several unfortunate racial stereotypes as two women, the rail-thin spinster Miss Cuspidor Lee, played by Maud Frisbee, and the much married and much widowed and rather mammy-like Mrs. Margarine Scrub, played by another Maud 425-pound actress Maud Johnson, battle at times literally for the affection of bachelor Quintus Weefalls, who spends most of the film trying to escape both of their attentions. But even in that film, there was a surprising resolution, which hinted at the more accurate and sympathetic portraits of Black life that would follow in Norman's subsequent films. The film ends after a third woman, an actress named Dazzle Zenor, does just that. She dazzles Quintus, weds him, and ultimately turns him into a good family man. The last scene, in fact, is of the now married but understandably overwhelmed Quintus holding his three newborn babies, played, as the ads state, by real colored triplets. That unusual depiction of affectionate Black family life was indeed a rarity, even among race pictures, and it was entirely absent in dominant white cinema depictions, which relied on the clownish caricatures and antiquated stereotypes of the 19th century minstrel shows and plantation literature that informed so much of early non-race white dominant film. Released around the same time as The Love Bug, Norman's drama The Green-Eyed Monster was significantly more progressive. In that picture, two rival engineers compete to win the great mail race. They also vie for the hand of Helen Powers, daughter of railroad superintendent Bernard Powers. An independent woman who knows her own mind and who readily asserts it, Helen rebuffs Jim Hilton, who covets her affection, but welcomes the attention of Hilton's rival, Jack Manning. Hilton bristles at Helen's rejection and plots his revenge. By sabotaging Manning, he figures that he can win the race, change Helen's mind, and claim victory over his rival. After the race begins, Hilton throws a switch that will derail several trains and ensure that Manning cannot possibly continue, much less win. But Hilton's attempt to stop Manning fails, his treacherous scheme is exposed, and ultimately he is jailed for his crime. Meanwhile, Helen accepts Manning's proposal, and the film ends happily with a large and extravagant wedding scene. As a story of middle class life, The Green Eyed Monster was exciting, well crafted, and consistent with the theme of racial uplift and the motif of race ambition. And notably, Helen was an essential part of that story. Not only does her name, Powers, suggest the agency that she wields, just as Manning's name suggests his, her depiction in the film serves to emphasize the symbols of success and opportunity, which Norman has insisted are available to all aspiring Blacks, women as well as men, who are willing to work hard to achieve their ambitions. Sophisticated and well educated, Helen lives in an elegant home, which boasts flowering gardens and goldfish filled fountains. Her expensive attire is both professional and refined. At her disposal is the family's automobile, complete with a chauffeur to drive her wherever she wants to go. And after her big gala wedding celebration, she is whisked away with her new husband in a flashy limousine. The home, the cars, the clothing are all obvious and immediately recognizable markers of Black achievement and success. And Helen herself is quite simply, in many ways, the embodiment of the new Negro woman, the strong, self-possessed, and fashionable icon who is emblematic of modernity and particularly of Black respectability. Let's pause for a moment to explore the social and cultural significance of that concept. New Negro woman was a self-descriptive term coined by Margaret Murray Washington, educator, essayist, and wife of Booker T. Washington, who saw that type as a symbolic leader in the Black uplift mission who could and would inspire white Americans to recognize the role of African Americans in the national rhetoric of progress. By signifying racial advancement, the new Negro woman could take on the cause of the so-called moral regeneration of a whole race of women, use her respectability to create a new ideal of womanhood, and serve as an agent of social change to counter the racist myths of Black female subservience and, worse yet, of immorality derived from and endorsed by slavery. In other words, the new Negro woman created a new definition of Black femininity based on intellect and respectability, not on tired stereotype. Moreover, she was marked by her neatness of dress, her propriety, her etiquette, her sense of family responsibility, and her pride in maintaining her home and her possessions. As Mrs. Booker T. Washington noted in her 1895 article, The New Negro Woman, under slavery, Negro women had been given in marriage at the whim of their master's family and sold from her husband as the master's financial interests demanded, with no more pity than was exhibited at the selling of a hog. So Washington encouraged those African American women who were fortunate enough to enjoy greater advantages to influence those with less, urging them to rise, shine, and push along in the work of helping our women in the South, in the North, and everywhere that it's needed. Let us rise with our money, though it be little. Let us rise with our voices, though they be weak, with our hands, even though they be feeble, and do this all important work. By the 1910s, the white new woman had become ubiquitous in mainstream American culture, film, fashion, advertising, even politics. And white filmmakers, especially the early serial filmmakers like the Wharton brothers and Pathé Studios, regularly featured her in their productions. Even the names of the most popular serials of that day reflected the white new woman's prominence. The Perils of Pauline, The Exploits of Elaine, The Adventures of Kathleen, The Hazards of Helen, The Mysteries of Myra, Pearl of the Army. The new Negro woman, however, was an even more radical and more complicated construct. The intersections between the media, consumer culture, and politics that gave rise to this more progressive understanding of Black feminism combined the ideas of the white new woman and the new Negro movement promoted by Alain Locke. For Mrs. Washington, the term new Negro woman denoted a middle class respectability, domesticity, and race progress, all of which served as a political trope to counter racist stereotypes of the familiar Black mammy. Notably, though, the new Negro woman, although allied peripherally, was not synonymous with the white new woman. As historian Ina Rabinovich Fox has observed, because of the problematic implications for Blacks, Washington deliberately refrained from tapping into the kinds of independence and sexual freedom associated with the white new woman, and instead emphasized the virtues of motherhood alongside professional accomplishments in education and work, shaping the new Negro woman as the epitome of middle-class refinement and genteel appearance. That image of the new Negro woman quickly evolved to suit the new reality of millions of African American women who left the South to seek better lives and improved economic fortunes in the growing urban centers, mainly in the North. According to Fox and other historians, although Northern migration did not necessarily free Black women from racial discrimination or domestic service, it did provide more options for upward mobility and political participation through the right to vote. And it allowed them to shape a racial identity and political consciousness with a modern image of Blackness that was quintessentially urban and emphasized leisure and consumption rather than labor. The Black press endorsed and promoted such notions of Black female middle class respectability and upward mobility, and often featured portraits of accomplished women of color that countered the imagery in the white press and refuted charges of inequality and moral inferiority. And using the mass medium of film, race filmmakers sought to advance even more widely these ideas of racial progress, Black achievement, and race uplift by conveying positive visual imagery, especially of Black women, in their pictures. In short, from her fashion sense to her decorous behavior, from her political awareness to her increased social engagement, the new Negro woman challenged outdated notions of Black women as subservient domestics and refuted outdated definitions of race based on the supporting roles that Black women had played in white households. The new Negro woman's depiction, especially in race films by Norman and his contemporaries, literally illustrated these desirable and virtuous qualities and served visually to interrogate and negate the pejorative imagery in dominant white cinema. So Norman's depictions of Helen Cooper in The Green-Eyed Monster was therefore a matter of considerable significance. Contrary to the Mabbies and Jezebels that were ubiquitous in the popular white pictures by D.W. Griffith and others, Norman's Helen was a deliberately and decidedly different kind of heroine, a model of the new Negro woman who embodied African American modernism in post-war America and was capable of redefining ideals of womanhood, racial citizenship, female identity, and social mobility. A woman who was self-determined, independent, increasingly emancipated from older notions of gender politics, a woman who challenged exclusion from political and cultural currents, and a woman who helped to transform thinking about the role of Black women as they moved into the public sphere. While Helen was the first of the new Negro women heroines that Norman featured in his race films, she was most assuredly not his last. Norman followed up The Green-Eyed Monster with a pair of Westerns shot in the Oklahoma Territory in the old Black town of Boley. Those films, which celebrated both the novelty and the symbolic value of Western themes and characters, served as stirring metaphors for Black individualism and opportunity. Both Westerns featured renowned Black actress Anita Bush, known as the Little Mother of colored drama. a distinguished stage performer who had begun acting as a young girl and who later toured overseas in the landmark American musical In Dahomey with legendary dance and comedy team Burt Williams and George Walker. She formed her own acting troupes, first the vaudeville company called the Hula Hula Dancers, and then the Anita Bush Players, a company of highly talented and versatile Black actors and actresses that eventually became the famed Lafayette Players. Norman, a shrewd and savvy marketer, knew that Anita Bush's name alone would draw crowds to see his new film. And he was absolutely right. But besides bringing a certain cachet to his films, Norma was counting on Bush to draw on her extensive connections among Black actors, which she promised to do. And indeed, it was thanks to her intervention that Norma was able to cast opposite her Lawrence Chenault, a handsome and longtime leading man in Black cinema. Chenault had previously worked with Bush in her eponymous dramatic acting company and again in the Lafayette Players, so it was an effective and fortuitous cinematic pairing. Although much of the plot of the two westerns centered on trick riding and rodeo performances by actual Black cowboys such as Bill Pickett and other stars of the legendary Miller Brothers 101 Ranch Wild West show, Bush was cast in both westerns as the female lead. To secure her services, Norman agreed to pay her $125 a week, less than she originally requested, but almost twice what he paid the male stars like Chenault and Pickett. At that salary, Norman underscored, Bush was earning the highest of any colored performer, male or female, which may have been a slight exaggeration, though probably not too far from the truth. Norman even took the unusual step of paying her vaudeville partner, whom she was forced to leave behind in New York City, a partial salary to compensate for the curtailing of their act during the duration of the filming. In the first of the westerns, The Bulldogger, Bush received prominent credit, which in itself was already a significant marker. Even more salient, though, was the conception of her character in the film. Bush played Anita, the daughter of cowhand and cowboy Bill Pickett. Notably, although it had little to do with the actual plot, she was introduced as a graduate of Linwood College, thus an educated and progressive modern woman. That was no incidental detail because it gave her character a far greater social resonance and established her as an example and model of female uplift and ambition. In the second of those films, The Crimson Skull, Bush received top billing above that of her popular male co-star, which was a nod both to the importance of her character and to her unparalleled reputation in race films. Her role, pivotal to the picture, was that of Anita Nelson, daughter of cattle rancher Lem Nelson, who becomes entangled with the Terrors, a masked group of outlaws that prey on the citizens of the small town of Boley. Although Norma was not as overtly political as rival filmmaker Oscar Micheaux, whose Within Our Gates was a direct and scathing response to D.W. Griffith's venomously racist film, The Birth of a Nation, it was surely no accident or coincidence that Norman's masked and hooded bandits in The Crimson Skull evoked images of the masked and hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan, who historically terrorized and brutalized Black citizens, particularly in the early decades of the 20th century. Just as an aside, most race filmmakers are almost always strapped for cash, and they were forced to become extremely resourceful simply to survive in the business. The Johnson brothers, for example, relied heavily on the talents and availability of Noble Johnson, already a popular featured player under contract to Universal Studios, to star in their early Lincoln Motion Picture Company films. While Oscar Micheaux used friends and family in his casts and even occasionally filmed in the homes of his acquaintances so that he didn't have to incur additional studio expenses. Norman likewise tried to contain the high cost of his productions. One way was by encouraging his actors, as stipulated in their contracts, to provide as much of their own clothing as possible. Instead of one-time pricey costume rentals, he bought inexpensive overalls and bandanas that he could use and reuse as costumes in his later films. And in the case of the terrorists whom we just mentioned, he even saved more money by sewing their hoods himself by hand. In his correspondence with Bush prior to filming, Norman specified that she should bring with her as much of her own personal wardrobe as possible for filming, including a few of her best small hats, since one of the opening scenes would show her arriving by train in proper, everyday clothes. He wanted that scene to establish her as a well-dressed and modern new Negro woman. And while he promised to provide her with a pair of ladies' Western boots, he urged her to pack several shirtwaist dresses which she could wear as part of her cowgirl outfit. Bush, it seems, was happy to comply. In fact, she told Norman that she was willing to try almost anything he required of her. And while she couldn't ride a horse, she felt she was a good enough actress to be able to act as if she could ride. And indeed, largely because of her talent and because of the strength of the character that she portrayed, the film, in Norman's words, filled all the seats in the big movie houses where it played, usually screening to standing room only crowds and turning patrons away because of the demand. Like Eve Mason, who rides against the Klan in order to protect her fellow rancher Hugh Van Allen in another of Oscar Michaw's films, The Symbol of the Unconquered, Bush's character, Anita Nelson, acts bravely and defiantly to aid Bob Calum, the foreman on her father's ranch, and the man whom she loves. Significantly, she is no jolly mammy or silly pickaninny or any of the other repulsive but ubiquitous stereotypes of Black women of her day. Rather, she is admirably strong willed and determined, undeterred by the threats of the outlaws, unafraid to confront them directly. Consequently, she suffers some of the very same tribulations and dangers at the hands of the terrors that the male characters do. Like Helen Powers in The Green Eyed Monster, Bush's Anita Nelson is another iteration of the capable and confident progressive Black woman. Norman's next film, Regeneration, released in 1923, was a real change of pace and of location. A South Seas adventure romance, filmed, of course, in Jacksonville, Florida. It revolved around a valuable treasure map and the attempts by a Black villain named Knife Hurley and his gang to steal it. Norman cast actress Stella Mayo, who is billed as the sensational colored film beauty, in the lead role of Violet Davis, the only child of a widowed sea captain. Upon her father's death, Violet is bequeathed his mysterious treasure map, which directs her to an island in the South Pacific. To get her there, she hires Jack Roper, owner of a fishing schooner. But of course, the journey does not go as planned. The villainous Knife Hurley, a mate on Roper's ship, conspires with the crew and plots to seize the map so he can secure the treasure for himself. After Knife sets the schooner on fire and strands Violet and Jack on board, he uses the only lifeboat to escape, leaving the couple to perish on the burning deck. Fortunately, they manage to drift to a remote island where they spend several years living a rather primal, Robinson Crusoe-like existence. Eventually, though, they encounter Knife again, who has found his way to the island, which naturally turns out to be the very island pictured on the treasure map. But this time, Violet and Jack gain the upper hand. They confront and defeat him, find the treasure themselves, and are rescued. Although only a brief clip of the film is extant and viewable, by the way, via a link in this program series website, the vital role in the action that Violet plays is as clear as it is indisputable. It is her legacy, the map, that's the key plot point in the picture. It is Violet who takes the initiative to travel to the mysterious island and who engages Jack to take her there. And it is Violet who, after being stranded and later left for dead by the scheming and treacherous Knife Hurley, tends the injured Jack and later fights side by side with him against the villain and his gang, all the while single-handedly fending off Knight's lecherous advances. In one of the few surviving stills from the film, she even wields a gun to hold off the villains and protect herself and Jack. Notably, the picture was more deliberately and overtly sexual than Norman's previous films, and certainly more than other race films, a fact that Norman exploited with his colorful posters and lobby cards, which revealed the scantily clad Stella Mayo being surprised in her bed by Knife Hurley, which incidentally was among the few scenes to which censors objected. Knowing that then as now sex sells, Norman also portrayed her boldly and provocatively in several ads and promotions as she bathed naked in the ocean waters, though to be fair, she is seen only in silhouette. While discreet, those depictions were nonetheless quite risque for the time. As Norman wrote to a colleague, he knew such scenes would draw audiences like a mustard poultice, and indeed they did. Yet the very fact that Norman introduced such scenes also says something about the new freedoms that he accorded to his heroines. Since the character Violet was central to the plot, not surprisingly, hers was the hardest role for Norman to cast. And in fact, he rejected numerous other actresses, Anita Bush among them, who lobbied him for the part. By that point, though, Norman considered Bush to be too old. He explained that he needed a woman with a good figure who could intrigue the audience and capture their fancy, especially as she becomes, in his words, ragged through the lapse of time. But in addition to youth and charm of face and figure, again his words, she had to be able to evoke the proper romantic atmosphere and bring out what he called the big theme, since she was the only woman in the film and the one around whom all the action revolved. Similarly, Zircon, the serial that Norman conceived and plotted but never produced, featured a strong and unflinching female character, Helen Desmond, the daughter of the owner of the Egyptian Potash Company, for whom the hero research chemist John Manning works. Helen is a tough and capable woman who matches Manning step by step as he journeys into the desert to discover more veins of the lucrative minerals. Together, they endure numerous adventures typical of the episodic serials that were so popular at that time. They are nearly overcome by a cloud of poison, left to die in a raging sandstorm, trapped in an ancient tomb, threatened by hungry crocodiles, dropped unceremoniously from a plane, left to roast alive on a burning ship, forced to fight both a monstrous tiger shark and a giant snake, almost suffocated in quicksand, and ultimately saved by invisible powder before returning home with rich new deposits of the miracle substance that makes them both, now happily husband and wife, millionaires. Helen is, in short, conceived and portrayed as being as much of an action heroine as Manning is an action hero. And that's no small distinction. It's therefore doubly disappointing that Norman could not raise the necessary advance funding to produce the serial, which would have been the only Black serial ever produced. But after all, as he pointed out in his correspondence, it would have cost more to complete the serial than 4 or 5 feature films, making it a financial risk and an expense he felt he could not incur. The best example, though, in fact, the only extant example of the way that Norman elevated the women in his films from mere adjuncts to vital and impressive characters in their own right, is the figure of Ruth Sawtelle, daughter of the Black station master Thomas Sawtelle in The Flying Ace. A proper, educated, and highly competent young woman, she supports her father to whom she is devoted, much the way Sylvia Landry supports her adoptive parents and Mishaws within our gates. And after Sawtelle is wrongly accused of theft, she solicits the help of and works closely with detective and ace pilot Captain Billy Stokes to exonerate him. A woman who thinks and acts independently and who is not bound by convention, she steadfastly refuses the advances of rival aviator Finley Tucker. And when Finley, in a peak of jealousy, kidnaps her and holds her hostage in his plane, telling her she must submit to him or take a walk in the clouds, she continues to rebuff him and effects her own rescue by making a daring mid-air escape, still one of the most exciting action scenes in early film. Incidentally, none of the aerial films was actually filmed in the air, but rather on the ground in the Norman studios. The importance of Ruth's character in the film is reinforced by the actress Norman selected to play her. Rather than casting an unknown pretty ingenue, and there are many from whom Norman could choose, with numerous young women volunteering their acting talents, Norman sought out Catherine Boyd, a distinguished performer from the Lafayette Players. Boyd, who had studied at Fisk and Oberlin colleges, was, as Norman described her, pretty, demure, yet possessed of the nerve of a female daredevil, a skill that served her well since she performed her own stunts in the film. The filming therefore required a certain physicality as well as a talent for theatrical interpretation and expression, and Boyd apparently had an abundance of both. When you watch the film, which you can do via a link on our website, you can see how Norman capitalized on that theatricality by filming a number of shots of her in close-up. Norman would utilize Boyd again as part of a team with her husband, Lawrence Kreiner, in his final film, Black Gold, in which she once again enacted a similar role, playing the daughter of a bank president and working zealously with her beau, Ace Brand, to exonerate Brand's employer, who's been wrongly accused of robbing the local bank as part of a scheme devised by greedy rivals to usurp his oil wells. Although the film shot in the old black town of Tatums, Oklahoma, does not survive even in a fragment, it's clear that Boyd's character, Alice Anderson, was central to the picture, and she figured prominently in the posters and the ads as well. As a film producer, Norman had a keen sense of what his audiences wanted, and that was interesting, action-packed storylines. So he gave them lots of on-screen adventure and suspense. But at the same time, he was aware of the prejudices and the restrictions that Blacks faced, and he determined to provide strong models of racial aspiration and race uplift in his films. So his plots almost always involve strong, free-thinking, ambitious, usually well-educated characters, including and especially women. Norman also celebrated and modeled Black female achievement in other ways. He intended, for example, to refilm his first Western, The Bulldogger, this time not with Cowboy Bill Pickett, but with a female writer and performer. Unfortunately, that never came to be. But even his intention is noteworthy, just as was his belief that a female action star would draw a big crowd, as big a crowd as a male action star would. Another project that never materialized, albeit for much sadder reason, involved Bessie Coleman. A prominent and admired figure in both the Black and white communities, Coleman was renowned for her daring as an aviatrix and legendary stunt pilot. The first American woman to earn a pilot's license, though it was earned in France, not the US, Coleman was a true trailblazer, and Norman was anxious to capitalize on her fame. His plan was to feature her as one of what he called living colored examples, which he envisioned as a series of standalone feature films, and only one of which, Black Gold in 1928, was ever completed. Norman's original intention was to film the photoplay that Coleman had proposed to him, a story that was based on her life. As they discussed the project, however, it evolved. Norman had a somewhat different take in mind, less of a biographical approach and more of an all-out aviation adventure, which ultimately became the idea underlying his best-known and only surviving film, The Flying Ace. It seems that he and Coleman had reached an agreement concerning the nature of the project and the direction of the picture in which she would star. But regrettably, their collaboration never came to fruition. Only a few weeks later, as Coleman was practicing for an air show to benefit the Negro Welfare League in Norman's hotel, Jacksonville, she and her manager were flying over the city to scout landing locations for her latest parachute stunt, which she would be attempting the next day. But the biplane went into a spinning dive, and Coleman, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the plane and died instantly. Her untimely death at 36 shocked the public and made her the object of even more interest and fascination. Norman, however, managed to turn Coleman's tragedy into his own personal triumph. More committed than ever to an aviation picture, he moved forward with his own version, which he wrote himself, and in which he modeled his adventurous heroine, Ruth Sawtelle, on the character of Bessie Coleman. And by a number of accounts, Boyd, who played Sawtelle, even resembled Coleman. Like his fellow race filmmakers, Norman was determined to give his audiences the role models they craved but never saw in mainstream studio productions. In his 7 race films, he distinguished himself by reversing the old stereotypes, especially of African American women, by celebrating Black accomplishment, and by creating new visual imagery that countered the pejorative images in the dominant white film of his era. In particular, by making his progressive female characters integral to his plots, not mere adjuncts to the action, he elevated them and accorded them a real cinematic and social importance. Like the early race film phenomenon itself, Norman's active filmmaking career was short-lived, less than a decade between late 1919 and early 1928. Nevertheless, he blazed new social and cinematic trails. His work was essential to the imagination and depiction of new roles that Blacks could assume in society and in the emerging fight for civil rights in this country and in the history and sociology of the Great Migration. Like his fellow race filmmakers, Norman made a change in how movie producers viewed Black moviegoers, and perhaps more importantly, in how Blacks viewed themselves in the transition to modern urban life. In particular, he promoted positive imagery of smart, modern, ambitious women, all of whom were examples of the new Negro woman. From Helen Powers in The Green-Eyed Monster and Helen Desmond in Zircon to Ruth Sawtelle in The Flying Ace and Alice Anderson in Black Gold, those women demonstrated to moviegoers the depth and breadth not only of his female characters, but also of the talented actresses who brought them to the screen. Norman gave his audiences reason to acknowledge and to honor real Blacks as opposed to the unreal Blacks depicted in dominant cinema. And like his fellow race filmmakers, about whom you'll be hearing in the presentations that follow, by attempting to reverse some of those familiar stereotypes, he helped to give voice and agency to the Black women in his silent films. I encourage you to view Norman's pioneering work for yourselves by using the links in this program series to The Flying Ace and to the extant fragmentary clips from Bulldogger and Regeneration. Thank you for your attention and your interest, and thank you once again to the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum for hosting this series, and to Florida Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for providing grant funding to make it possible, and for affording this opportunity to give fresh voice to the African American women who are a vital part of this exciting period of race filmmaking.